In January 1862, the weakest point of the sprawling 400-mile arc of the Confederate position in Kentucky was at the point just south of the Kentucky border in western Tennessee, where the Cumberland and Tennessee rivers came to within 10 miles of one another and turned in parallel toward the Ohio. The Confederate Army had constructed forts on both of these rivers near the Kentucky-Tennessee border to secure their positions: Fort Henry on the Tennessee and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. On January 30th, General Ulysses S. Grant set out from Paducah to take those forts. His troops arrived at the marshy approaches to Fort Henry on February 4th. 2 days later, a squadron of Union warships, under the command of Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote, steamed up the Tennessee River to Fort Henry and opened fire. Not long after the 4 ironclads and 3 wooden gunboats began their bombardment of the fort, its commander, General Lloyd Tillman, recognizing that his position was untenable, evacuated the infantry. He took them overland to Fort Donelson. Tillman kept his artillery in place to resist Foote's bombardment, but they were able to hold out for only 2 hours. Tillman surrendered to Foote at 3 in the afternoon, and Grant's forces occupied Fort Henry. That accomplished, Grant turned his attention to Fort Donelson. Though Donelson was the more elaborate and the best fortified of the two positions, the proximity of Fort Henry and the prospect of its new landlords turning its artillery on Fort Donelson caused great concern for the Confederate commanders. General Tillman's relocated infantrymen at Fort Donelson found themselves under the command of General Gideon Pillow. Within days, help for Pillow arrived in the form of, first, General John Floyd, and then General Simon Bolivar Buckner. General Grant's 10,000-man force again set out overland, arriving at Fort Donelson on February 12th. Finding the defenses too strong for an immediate assault, they waited for reinforcements. On February 14th, as infantry reinforcements brought the total number of men at Grant's disposal to 27,000, the ironclad gunboat Carondelet began shelling the fort to little effect. The next morning, General Pillow led a successful attack against Grant's right flank, but failed to follow it up. When night finally fell after a day of fierce and bloody fighting, the Confederate commanders inside Fort Donelson began making arrangements to escape. Both Floyd and Pillow slipped away with sizable fighting forces, leaving Buckner in command of the fort's remaining personnel. Lieutenant Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest, the soon-to-be christened Wizard in the Saddle, also broke out with his cavalry unit along a flooded road in the direction of Nashville. The next morning, Buckner sent an emissary to his old West Point classmate, Grant, seeking to negotiate surrender terms. Grant's reply that he would accept no terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender surprised Buckner. But he believed that a refusal of the Yankee demand would lead to the massacre of his men. His reply reflected his anger.
Sir, the distribution of forces under my command incident to an unexpected change of commanders, and the overwhelming force under your command compel me, notwithstanding the brilliant success of the Confederate arms yesterday, to accept the ungenerous and unchivalrous terms which you propose. I am, sir, your very obedient servant, S.B. Buckner, Brigadier General, CSA.
When the surrender was completed, the two generals sat down for drinks. Grant even repaid his prisoner some money that he owed him. The loss of Forts Henry and Donelson, coupled with the defeat just 3 weeks earlier of Felix Zollicoffer's rebel force at Mill Springs, drove the Confederate Central Army of Kentucky entirely out of the Commonwealth state. In a matter of a few weeks more, the Union armies claimed Columbus, Bowling Green, and even Nashville, Tennessee, which was the first Confederate state capital to fall. Before February 1862, there had been little fighting along the rivers south of Cairo, Illinois. But in the next 4 months, these rivers became the scene of decisive action. The strategic value of the river network radiating from Cairo had been clear from the outset of the war. This southernmost city in the Union grew into a large military and naval base. From there, Army-Navy task forces could launch invasions up the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers and down the Mississippi toward Vicksburg. When the Butterfield Company opened a stagecoach line between St. Louis and San Francisco in 1858, a shrewd Arkansas farmer who lived on the route converted his home into a tavern. His name was James Cox. His large 2-story frame house stood just below the Missouri border at the east end of a swell of ground called Pea Ridge. To make sure that travelers would recognize and remember his tavern, Cox mounted the horns and skull of a huge elk at the center of the ridgepole. Elkhorn Tavern would soon be known as a place of good cheer. 3 years later, war was raging northward in Missouri, and the transcontinental coaches were no longer running on that route. During 1861, the Confederates won some victories in Missouri, but after Brigadier General Samuel R. Curtis took command of Union forces on Christmas Day, the tide began to turn. Union forces in Missouri during the latter part of 1861 and early 1862 had effectively pushed Confederate forces out of the state. By the spring of 1862, General Curtis was determined to pursue the Confederates back into Arkansas with his Army of the Southwest. Curtis moved his approximately 10,500 Union soldiers and 50 artillery pieces into Benton County, Arkansas, along a small stream called Sugar Creek. The Union forces consisted primarily of soldiers from Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and Ohio. Over half of the Federal soldiers were German immigrants. Curtis found an excellent defensive position on the north side of the creek and proceeded to fortify it. He placed artillery for an expected Confederate assault from the south. Meanwhile, Jefferson Davis had appointed handsome and flamboyant General Earl Van Dorn as overall commander of the Trans-Mississippi District. This was to quell a simmering conflict between competing generals, Sterling Price of Missouri and Benjamin McCulloch of Texas. Van Dorn's Army of the West totaled approximately 16,000 men, including 800 Cherokee Indian troops, and contingents from the Missouri State Guard, as well as Confederate cavalry, infantry, and artillery from Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Missouri. Van Dorn was aware of the Union movements into Arkansas and was intent on destroying Curtis's Army of the Southwest and reopening the gateway into Missouri. General Van Dorn did not wish to attack Curtis's entrenched position head-on. On March 4, 1862, he split his army into 2 divisions under Price and McCulloch and ordered them to march north along the Bentonville Detour with the hopes of getting behind Curtis and cutting off his lines of communication. Van Dorn left his supply trains behind in order to make better speed, a decision that later proved to be a crucial one. The Confederates made an arduous 3-day forced march down the Bentonville cutoff from Fayetteville in the midst of a freezing storm. Many of the Confederate soldiers were ill-equipped and barefoot, and it was said that one could find the army by following the bloody footprints in the snow. The Confederates arrived at their destination strung out along the road, hungry and tired. Compounding the Confederate problems was the late arrival of McCulloch, which led Van Dorn to split his forces in 2. Van Dorn ordered McCulloch to circle around the western end of Pea Ridge, turn east along the south face, and meet Price's division at Elkhorn Tavern. Van Dorn and Price would travel east along the north face of the ridge, secure Elkhorn Tavern, and wait for McCulloch. These delays allowed Curtis to begin repositioning his army to meet the unexpected attack from his rear and get his forces between the 2 wings of Van Dorn's forces. McCulloch's force consisted of a division of cavalry under General James McIntosh, a division of infantry under Colonel Louis Hébert, and a brigade of Cherokee Indians under Brigadier General Albert Pike. McCulloch's troops swung westward around Pea Ridge and plowed into elements of the Federal Army at a small village named Leetown, where a fierce firefight erupted. McCulloch and McIntosh were killed in action soon after the clash began, and Colonel Hébert was captured. These events effectively shattered the Confederate command structure, and they were unable to organize an effective attack in the resulting chaos. On the other side of Pea Ridge, Van Dorn and Price encountered the Federals near Elkhorn Tavern. Van Dorn ordered an attack, and by nightfall the Confederates succeeded in pushing the Union forces back. They seized the Telegraph and Huntsville roads and succeeded in cutting Curtis's lines of communication at Elkhorn Tavern. The survivors from McCulloch's command joined Van Dorn at the tavern during the night. Colonel Stand Watie led his mounted rifles regiment against Union artillery positions set up in the battlefield. Watie also covered the Confederate retreat at the battle and later was sent west to fight. On the morning of March 8th, Curtis massed his artillery near the tavern and launched a counterattack in an attempt to recover his supply lines. Leading the attack was Curtis's second-in-command, Franz Sigel. The massed artillery, combined with cavalry and infantry attacks, began to crumple the Confederate lines. By noon, Van Dorn realized that he was low on ammunition and that his supply trains were miles away with no hope of arriving in time to resupply his men. Despite outnumbering his opponent, Van Dorn withdrew down the Huntsville Road. Approximately 2,000 Confederates fell in the battle at Pea Ridge, including a large number of officers. Federal forces suffered approximately 1,400 casualties. With the defeat at Pea Ridge, the Confederates never again seriously threatened the state of Missouri. As the cold, wet winter of 1862 dragged into March, General Albert Sidney Johnston and what remained of the Confederate Army of Central Kentucky straggled into Corinth, Mississippi, a railroad crossroads town near the Tennessee border. Here, the general was determined to regroup, recover, and see if the spring rains would bring with them from heaven a second chance to conquer Kentucky. Waiting for Johnston in Corinth, in addition to the remnants of Zollicoffer's defeated force, were General P.G.T. Beauregard and his Army of the Mississippi, along with a cadre of crack troops from the Department of Alabama and West Florida. They were under the command of a man already on a collision course with history, General Braxton Bragg. Though the Confederate armies had been driven from Kentucky, the Union failed to fully exploit the victory by pressing their disorganized foe. There was no unified federal command in Kentucky. For weeks after the fall of Fort Donelson, General Henry W. Halleck, whose Department of Missouri command included the portion of Kentucky that lay west of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, argued with General Don Carlos Buell, commander of the Department of Ohio, which included the rest of Kentucky, over what to do next. Ultimately, Halleck grew weary of the debate, and on his own sent General Ulysses S. Grant south up the Tennessee River in the direction of Corinth. Abraham Lincoln also had grown weary of Buell's equivocating, and on March 9th combined the Department of Ohio and the Department of Missouri into a single command, and placed Halleck in charge. Halleck immediately ordered Buell to move his army to Savannah, Tennessee, and link up with Grant's. He meant for the two generals to attack Johnston at Corinth. But the pouting Buell drug his feet and took weeks to reach Grant, who waited with his men at the Tennessee River town of Pittsburgh Landing. Realizing that Federal strength was increasing by the day, Johnston decided that his army would strike before Buell's forces could link up with Grant. After 2 months of retreats and humiliation, Johnston, on April 6th, unleashed the attack that he hoped would drive the complacent Yankees into the Tennessee River and turn the tide of the war in the West. At 6:30 a.m., Johnston gave the order for a general advance and rode to the front with his staff to take personal charge of the attack. He told a subordinate, "Tonight we will water our horses in the Tennessee River." With the brigade of General Pat Cleburne in the vanguard, Confederate Generals William Hardee and Leonidas Polk's divisions slammed into the Yankee right flank. Soon, even the most stalwart Union soldiers were forced to take to their heels lest they be killed or captured. By 8:45, the entire Federal front had given way, and the Federal reserves were beset with throngs of stragglers and wounded making their way to Pittsburgh Landing. While his army tottered on the brink of disaster, Grant was making his way from his headquarters to the sounds of the guns. The general realized that unless his lines held and Buell's Army of the Ohio could be hastened to the field, his army would be crushed. In order to seize the Yankee position, the Confederates had to cross an open field swept by bullets, soon to be dubbed the Hornet's Nest. Wave after wave the Confederates came on. Time after time, they were thrown back. By 2 p.m., Johnston could not stand the carnage at the Hornet's Nest salient. As MacArthur's brigade began to fall back, the Confederate commander rushed forward shouting at his men. "I will lead you," he shouted. The men rallied, but Johnston was hit in the calf during the assault. Ignoring treatment, he stayed in the fight until 2:30.
At the moment the general sank down in his saddle, leaning to the left, I put my arm around him and pulling him to me, I said, "General, are you wounded?" He said yes, and I fear seriously. We lifted him from his horse and laid him upon the ground. He never said another word. Isham Harris.
Johnston's wound was minor and easily treatable, but on the verge of a great victory, he bled to death. At 5:30, all resistance at the Hornet's Nest ended. 2,300 Union soldiers were marched to the rear as prisoners, while hundreds more lay dead on the field they so valiantly defended. The battle at the Hornet's Nest was futile, but it did buy time for Grant to throw together a new defensive position. Following the capture of the Hornet's Nest, an hour of daylight remained for the Confederates to follow up their costly success. General Beauregard assumed command, and in the approaching darkness, he ordered his men to cease fire so that he could sort out his tangled troops and resume the attack at dawn. In the darkness, he let victory slip through his fingers. Overnight, Buell finally arrived, and on the morning of April 7th, his forces joined Grant's in attacking the Confederates, who were driven all the way back to Corinth. The Battle of Shiloh, the bloodiest yet in the year-old Civil War, was a decisive win for the Union, but it did not yield anything like the political dividends for which Lincoln had hoped. The casualties horrified the public in both the North and South. But if Shiloh added to Lincoln's worries, it made things far worse for Jefferson Davis. When Beauregard compounded the ignominy of his miscalculation and ultimate retreat from Shiloh by abandoning Corinth on May 30th for Tupelo, 50 miles further south, the Confederate public was outraged, and Davis moved to control the damage. He replaced Beauregard as commander of the Army of the Mississippi with Braxton Bragg. The two armies now moved down separate roads to heal and recover from Shiloh, but in just 112 days, they would continue their dance of death among the rolling hills of central Kentucky. After the failure of Flag Officer DuPont to quickly close the southern ports on the Carolina coast, the Navy began to look for other ways to attack the coastal forts. Some thought that the answer could be the revolutionary ironclad warships, such as the Monitor. The Monitor had proven its worth when, in March of 1862, it slugged it out with the Confederate ironclad Virginia, the former USS Merrimack, at Hampton Roads. Gustavus Fox, an aide to Navy Secretary Gideon Welles, boasted that the strange little craft could attack Charleston Harbor with impunity.
Given a fleet of armored vessels, the Navy could blast its way past the enemy forts and bring Charleston to its knees in a day. Gustavus Fox.
He would soon have a chance, both on the coast and on the Mississippi River, to prove that those were more than boastful words. Before the war began, Vicksburg, Mississippi had become the most prosperous and sophisticated town on the southern frontier. Built atop bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, the city was a center of trade. It was also a center of culture, education, and banking. Proud citizens called their hometown the Queen City of the Bluff. All this was about to change. Vicksburg's topography also made it a natural fortress. Fitted with interlocking batteries, the city was impregnable to frontal assault from the river and from across the plain on the east. To the north and south stretched the Yazoo River Delta, a swamp that no army could penetrate. Yet, so important was Vicksburg that Union forces could do nothing more than try to do the impossible, no matter what the cost would be. Federal commanders knew that to fail here would unravel the Union's snake-like grip on the Confederacy. In 1862, there was not much that the two warring presidents agreed upon. On Vicksburg, they shared a common opinion. Davis would later write of Vicksburg,
Vicksburg is a nailhead that held the South's two halves together.
Lincoln recognized that the fall of Vicksburg would slice the Confederacy in two.
The whole lower Mississippi region is the backbone of the rebellion.
Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter understood the importance of the deadly game at hand.
Let us get Vicksburg and the country's ours. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket. We can take all the ports of the Confederacy and they can still defy us from Vicksburg. It means hog and hominy without limit, fresh troops from all the states of the far South, and the cotton country from where they can raise the staple without interference. Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter.
By the spring of 1862, the Union already controlled parts of the Mississippi River. In April of that year, David Farragut had sailed a Union fleet into the mouth of the Mississippi and blasted his way past two enemy forts guarding New Orleans. Union troops then captured the Crescent City, closing it as a supply base to the Confederates. At the same time, Federal troops and gunboats had been fighting their way south down the Mississippi, winning victories from Kentucky all the way to Missouri. They now had to take the rest of the river, and Vicksburg was the key. First to try was Farragut, who had been ordered to steam up the Mississippi and take Vicksburg immediately after capturing New Orleans. Farragut moved his deep-water ships upstream through the twisting channels and forced the surrender of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Natchez, Mississippi. On reaching Vicksburg, Farragut was greeted by a rude surprise. When he demanded the city's immediate surrender, the defenders replied, "Mississippians don't know and refuse to learn how to surrender." The city's defenders had good reason to be cocky. While the Union fleet was overcoming sandbars and shifting channels, reinforcements had been busy preparing Vicksburg's defenses. Also, the guns of Farragut's warships could not be elevated enough to fire at the enemy batteries high on the bluffs as the Confederate guns fired down on them. Judging the situation hopeless, Farragut headed back toward New Orleans. There, he was ordered by Lincoln himself to try again. This time, he took some mortar schooners that could lob shells up to the bluffs. On the night of June 28th, the Union fleet tried to run the guns at Vicksburg. The ships blasted away at the town and the defenders. The defending rebel batteries returned fire with an unmatched fury. Three of the Federal ships were forced to turn back as they approached the city heights. Many of the others were damaged, but managed to get upriver past the gauntlet of shot and shell. In spite of the hail of fire that pelted them, Union losses were a mere 15 dead and 30 wounded. Farragut had run the river, but had failed to damage the defenses of the city. The rebels still commanded the river from the bluffs. With his fleet at anchor out of range of the city's guns, Farragut tried to figure out what to do next, when suddenly the Confederates took matters into their own hands. A single Confederate ram, the CSS Arkansas, boldly steamed down the Mississippi and through the middle of the Union fleet with all guns blazing. The Arkansas was badly damaged, but the Federals were in worse shape. Every Union ship was damaged, and 17 men were killed and another 42 wounded. Farragut wrote to Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles of his frustration.
I am satisfied that it is not possible for us to take Vicksburg without an army force of 12 to 15,000 men.
Farragut had had enough. In late July, he sailed back down the Mississippi. The Navy's 3-month attempt to take the Gibraltar of North America had failed. Now it would be the Army's turn, and a maverick general would gamble his entire force in one of the most dangerous operations of the war. The spring of 1862 was a dark time for the Confederacy. Defeats had come on the Mississippi River, in Tennessee, and along the North Carolina coast. A powerful Union army was poised outside Washington, ready to strike a blow against Richmond, the Confederate capital. The events that took place that spring along the rivers, swamps, and fields of the Virginia Peninsula were initiated to do just that: capture Richmond and end the war. The Peninsula Campaign was the strategic concept of Union Army Commander-in-Chief Major General George B. McClellan. By advancing up the Virginia Peninsula, McClellan would avoid suffering the high casualties caused by a march south on Richmond from northern Virginia. The powerful Union Navy could first transport McClellan's army to the peninsula, then, using the James and York rivers, protect that army's flanks as it advanced toward Richmond. It was an excellent plan, and McClellan's army seemed unstoppable. Major General Benjamin Franklin Butler was the first Union commander to recognize the strategic importance of the Virginia Peninsula. His defeat during the June 10, 1861 Battle of Big Bethel ended Butler's feeble attempt to capture Richmond via the peninsula. McClellan, however, viewed the peninsula as his second choice. His initial plan was an advance against Richmond by way of Urbana on the Rappahannock River. This would have placed the Union Army behind General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate Army, then positioned in northern Virginia. When Johnston withdrew further south from the Manassas line on March 8, 1862, McClellan had to scrap his original plan and select his second alternative, the peninsula. McClellan believed that by using Fort Monroe as a base, he could march against Richmond with security, although with less celebrity and brilliancy of results up the peninsula. In early March 1862, McClellan found himself under considerable political pressure to launch some advance against Richmond. Even as he shared the merits of his plan with President Abraham Lincoln, it started to unhinge. The emergence of the ironclad ram CSS Virginia, which was the captured and refitted USS Merrimack, on March 8, 1862, sent shockwaves through the Union command. In one day, the Virginia destroyed 2 Union warships, the USS Congress and USS Cumberland, and threatened federal control of Hampton Roads. A strategic balance was quickly gained when the novel Union ironclad USS Monitor arrived and fought the Virginia to a standstill the next day. While both sides claimed victory, the Virginia's presence denied the James River to federal use. Confident that the Monitor could hold off any advance against his transports by the Confederate ironclad, McClellan proceeded with his campaign. He began shipping his 121,500-strong army with all of its supplies and armaments to Fort Monroe on March 17, 1862. He intended to move against Richmond by way of the York River. On April 4, 1862, McClellan's army began its march up the peninsula. The next day, the Army of the Potomac found its path to Richmond slowed at first by heavy rains and then blocked by Confederate Major General John Bankhead Magruder's 13,000-strong Army of the Peninsula. Since his June 1861 victory at Big Bethel, Magruder had constructed 3 defensive lines across the peninsula. The most formidable of these lines was the second, a line which stretched from Yorktown along the Warwick River to the James River. As McClellan carefully surveyed the extensive Confederate fortifications, Prince John Magruder paraded his troops along the earthworks, deluding the Union commander into believing he was outnumbered. The events of April 5th changed McClellan's campaign. His plans for a rapid movement past Yorktown were upset by the unexpected Confederate defenses along the Warwick River. Lincoln's decision not to release General Irwin McDowell's First Corps from Northern Virginia to use in a flanking movement against the Confederate batteries at Gloucester Point also upset McClellan's plans. The U.S. Navy also refused to attempt any offensive action in the York River. Flag Officer Lewis Goldsborough feared that the CSS Virginia might attack the Union fleet while it attempted to silence the Confederate guns at Yorktown and Gloucester Point. Since McClellan's reconnaissance, provided by Detective Alan Pinkerton and Professor Thaddeus Lowe's balloons, confirmed his belief that he was outnumbered by the Confederates, the Union commander thought that he had no choice but to besiege the Confederate defenses. As his men built gun emplacements for the 103 siege guns McClellan had brought to the peninsula, General Joseph E. Johnston moved his entire Confederate army down to the lower peninsula from his camps in northern Virginia. Johnston believed that the Confederate position was weak, noting that no one but McClellan could have hesitated to attack. McClellan's men did make one attempt to break the Confederate Warwick-Yorktown line. Brigadier General William F. Baldy Smith sent elements of the Vermont Brigade across the Warwick River to disrupt Confederate control of Dam No. 1. The poorly coordinated assaults on April 16, 1862, failed to break through the vulnerable Confederate target. The siege continued another 2 weeks, even though Johnston counseled retreat. Johnston advised that the fight for Yorktown must be one of artillery, in which we cannot win. Finally, just as McClellan made his last preparations to unleash his heavy bombardment on the Confederate lines, Johnston abandoned the Warwick-Yorktown line on May 3rd. McClellan was surprised by the Confederate withdrawal. The Union commander attempted to cut off Johnston's retreat, ordering Brigadier General Edwin V. Bull Sumner to attack the Confederate rear guard. The result was the bloody, indecisive May 5th Battle of Williamsburg. Fighting raged in front of Fort Magruder until dark, but it was Brigadier General Winfield Scott Hancock's flanking move into several unmanned redoubts on the Confederate left, which forced the Southerners to abandon the Williamsburg line. McClellan did not arrive on the battlefield until dark, as the engagement was ending. He had been in Yorktown, supervising the embarkation of Brigadier General William B. Franklin's division onto transports. Franklin rushed up the York River to block Johnston's withdrawal to Richmond. Although able to secure a beachhead at Eltham's Landing on May 6th, Franklin moved inland timidly. There, Franklin was blocked by John Bell Hood's Texans, and Johnston made his escape. President Lincoln, concerned by what he deemed McClellan's general lack of initiative, arrived at Fort Monroe on May 6th. 2 days later, the president supervised the Union's unsuccessful naval attack against Norfolk. Across the Elizabeth River from Norfolk was Portsmouth's Gosport Navy Yard. Gosport was the largest naval base and shipyard in the Confederacy and served as the Virginia's home port. The Confederate retreat from the lower peninsula had forced Major General Benjamin Huger to abandon Norfolk on May 9th. Without its base and unable to steam up the James River to Richmond because of its deep draft, the Virginia was destroyed by its crew on May 11, 1862. The door to the Confederate capital via the James River now lay open. A Union fleet moved up the river and approached within 7 miles of Richmond. On May 15, 1862, Confederate batteries atop Drury's Bluff repulsed the Federal advance. As McClellan's army neared the outskirts of the Confederate capital by the end of May, he extended his right to meet expected reinforcements from northern Virginia. In the meantime, Stonewall Jackson's successful operations in the Shenandoah Valley prompted Lincoln to continue to hold these reinforcements around Fredericksburg to help protect Washington from any Confederate advance. McClellan now found his army divided by the swampy Chickahominy River. Confederate Commander Joe Johnston was under pressure from Confederate President Jefferson Davis to do something about the approaching Federals. Taking advantage of heavy rains, which had made the Chickahominy nearly impassable, Johnston attacked McClellan's army south of the river along the villages of Seven Pines and Fair Oaks. The poorly coordinated assaults on May 31st failed, and Johnston was seriously wounded. The next day, June 1st, 1862, the battle continued, but Robert E. Lee, who assumed command of the Confederate forces around Richmond, ordered a withdrawal that afternoon.